She stepped off that stagecoach and looked at three of the most dangerous, most broken men in Montana, and she did not flinch. Not once. 6 women had come before her. 6 women had run. She had read his letters, all of them, and she had crossed a continent for the man who wrote about sunrises and root cellars in the same breath, because that was the kind of man who keeps his word. They thought she would last a week. She had other plans. This is the story of Wren Allgate in the winter that changed everything at Holt's Ridge. The story always began the same way in Ridgeback, Montana. It began with a stagecoach rattling up the mountain road carrying something fragile inside. It began with old Drummond pulling back on the reins at the top of the ridge, his breath clouding in the cold air, his eyes already carrying the look of a man who had made the same trip too many times and learned nothing good from any of them. It began with a woman stepping down from that coach and seeing for the first time what she had actually agreed to. 6 women had made that journey before the 7th arrived. 6 women had stood at the top of that ridge and looked out at Holt's Ridge Ranch, that sprawling compound of stone and timber and weathered fence posts, sitting alone in the high country like something the mountain had coughed up and forgotten. 6 women had climbed back into that same coach, sometimes weeping, sometimes silent, sometimes with an expression on their faces that Drummond had learned not to ask about. The first one lasted 3 weeks. She was a school teacher from Ohio named Priscilla, soft-spoken and proper, who had read the advertisement in a Philadelphia Gazette and thought the words ranch in Montana sounded like adventure. They did not sound like adventure when she arrived. They sounded like 3 men who communicated in grunts and silences, and the occasional single word dropped into conversation like a stone into still water. She left on a Tuesday without saying goodbye to any of them, and Drummond found her waiting by the road at dawn with her trunk already packed. The second lasted 11 days. Her name was Dorothy, and she came from a good family in Connecticut, which was perhaps the problem. Dorothy was accustomed to a certain quality of conversation over the dinner table, a certain warmth in the evening hours, a certain acknowledgement that she existed as a person with thoughts and feelings and opinions worth hearing. None of these things were available at Holt's Ridge. She lasted 11 days before the silence began to feel less like peace and more like burial. The 3rd through the 6th had blurred together in Drummond's memory into a single composite woman, a woman with varying hair colors and varying degrees of stubbornness, all of whom had eventually reached the same conclusion. The mountain was beautiful. The men were impossible. The arrangement made no sense for anyone involved, least of all for the woman imported from the civilized world to somehow survive in a place where winter lasted half the year and the nearest neighbor was 4 miles of mud road away. By the time the 7th woman arrived, Drummond had stopped making predictions out loud. He made them privately in the part of his mind where he kept things too uncharitable to say in company, and those predictions were not optimistic. He had been wrong before. He was about to be wrong again in a way he could not have anticipated. Her name was Wren Allgate. She was 23 years old, 5 feet and 3 inches tall, and she stepped off the stagecoach in Ridgeback, Montana on a gray November afternoon in 1873. With 1 trunk, 1 carpet bag, and the particular kind of stillness that belongs to people who have already survived something and know that surviving is simply a matter of continuing to move forward. Drummond watched her from his seat on the coach box. He had developed over 6 prior deliveries, a reliable eye for the moment when a woman first understood what she had gotten herself into. There was always a tell, a catch in the breath, a slight widening of the eyes, a particular way the hands tightened on a bag handle when the mind began to calculate the distance back to somewhere safe. Wren Allgate looked at the 3 men standing at the gate of Holt's Ridge Ranch and did not flinch. She did not reach for her bag handle. She did not draw a sharp breath or blink too many times or do any of the things that Drummond had cataloged across 6 prior arrivals. She looked at them the way a woman looks at a problem she has already decided to solve. Drummond felt something in his chest that he would later describe to his wife as unease, though what it actually was the particular discomfort of a man who has held a low opinion of something for a long time and is beginning to suspect he was wrong. She had not told him much during the long ride up from the valley. He had tried, as he always tried, to prepare her. He had mentioned that the men were particular. He had mentioned that previous arrangements had not worked out. He had mentioned as delicately as a man of his profession could manage that no woman had yet found Holt's Ridge to her liking. She had listened to all of this with a patience that seemed less like resignation and more like a person waiting for someone to finish saying something irrelevant. Then she had said, "What do you know about the water supply in winter?" The letter mentioned a well, but letters from the agency are not always reliable on practical details. Drummond had told her about the well. She had asked two more questions about the root cellar and the condition of the road after snowfall. And then she had gone quiet again, looking out the window at the mountains coming closer. And Drummond had understood in the slow way that understanding sometimes comes to a man who has been looking at something without seeing it, that this particular woman had not come to Holt's Ridge looking for adventure or romance or rescue from a difficult life. She had come because she had made a decision. And Wren Allgate was, as he would discover over the months that followed, a woman who did not unmake decisions. The three men standing at the gate were in their different ways exactly what 6 years of hard mountain living had made them. Silas Holt stood in the center. He was 34 years old and built like something the land itself had constructed for a specific purpose, wide across the shoulders, weathered in the face with hands that bore the particular scarring of a man who had spent years in contact with rope and metal and rough-cut wood. His beard was dark and untrimmed, grown out past the point where it suggested deliberate style and into the territory where it simply suggested that he had more important things to attend to. His eyes were a deep burnt amber color, the kind of eyes that had looked at a great many things without blinking and had learned to give very little away. He did not move when Wren stepped down from the coach. He did not offer his hand or step forward to take her bag or make any of the ordinary gestures that a man makes when a woman arrives at his door. He stood and he looked at her with the careful assessing stillness of a man who has learned that first impressions are data points, and he filed what he saw. She was small. She carried herself like she was not. There was a quality to her posture, an uprightness in the spine, a particular set to the jaw that suggested a person who had decided long ago that the world would not find her diminished regardless of its intentions. He nodded once. Ford Holt stood to the left of his older brother, and Ford was in almost every measurable way the opposite of Silas. He was 30 years old, broad-shouldered, with hair the color of autumn leaves and eyes of a cool, pale green that had a tendency to notice things they were not supposed to notice and comment on them before the internal filter that most people developed in childhood could engage. He was leaning against the fence post with a loose, deliberate casualness that was actually the posture of a man paying very close attention. And when Wren stepped down from the coach, he tilted his head at a slight angle and said at a volume that was meant to carry, "She is smaller than I thought she would be." It was the kind of remark that had on 3 separate prior occasions sent a woman's chin quivering and her eyes toward the middle distance where dignity goes to survive an insult. Wren Allgate looked at Ford Holt for exactly 1 second. "And you," she said, "are larger than the letter suggested, though I note the letter was not written by you, so perhaps that accounts for the discrepancy." Ford's casual smirk did something complicated. It tried to hold its shape and failed. What replaced it was not offense and was not pleasure exactly, but something that lived between those two things in the territory that belongs to a man who has just encountered something he did not expect and does not yet know how to categorize it. He blinked. Then he laughed. Not a polite laugh, not the social laughter of a man being gracious. A real one, short and sharp, surprised out of him. Abel Holt stood to the right of his oldest brother, and Abel was 26 years old and the tallest of the three, which was saying something, and also the most difficult to read, which was saying a great deal more. He had lighter hair than his brothers, a brown that caught the thin November sun and showed threads of amber in it, and his eyes were a dark, watchful gray. He was not leaning against anything. He was simply standing, hands loose at his sides, and he was not looking at Wren's face. He was looking at her hands. The hands of the women who had arrived before her had always told the same story. Smooth palms, careful nails, The hands of women whose physical relationship with the world had been mediated by gloves and gentility. The hands of women who had never been asked to do anything that required actual force. Wren Allgate's hands were not those hands. There were calluses at the base of her fingers. The nails were trimmed short impractically. There was a small healed burn scar on the inside of her right wrist, the kind of mark that a woman picks up from years of work near an open fire. Abel filed this information without expression. He did not speak. He did not need to yet. Wren looked at all three of them. Then she turned to Drummond, who was still sitting on the coach box with the reins loose in his hands and an expression of suspended expectation on his leathery face. "Thank you, Drummond," she said. Then she reached for her carpet bag. Silas was in front of her before she completed the motion. He did not ask. He simply took the bag from her hand with a directness that was not rudeness, but was the behavior of a man who has never had much patience for unnecessary back and forth, and then he turned and walked toward the path that led to the house. Wren followed him. Her boots were steady on the frozen gravel. Her breathing did not change. She walked in the wake of a man she had never met toward a house she had never seen in a part of the world that had nothing in common with the city where she had spent the last 6 years of her life, and she did not look back at the stagecoach. Drummond watched her go. "Well," he said quietly to no one in particular. Then he clicked his tongue and started the horses down the mountain, and for the first time in 7 attempts, he did not feel certain about how this was going to end. What Drummond did not know, and what the three Holt brothers did not know, and what even Wren herself had not said aloud to anyone, was the real reason she had chosen this particular advertisement from among the dozens that had crossed her path. It was the letters. Not the formal correspondence from the agency, which had been efficient and impersonal, and had told her very little about the men themselves. The real letters. The ones that Silas Holt had written and mailed to the agency over the course of 2 years. Letters that had been filed and partially misfiled and had ended up through a bureaucratic accident that Wren had never fully been able to reconstruct in a bundle of papers that a clerk had handed her while she was waiting in the agency office in Philadelphia. She had read them without intending to. Then she had read them again on purpose. They were not love letters. They were not even particularly warm by the standards of letters written for the purpose of attracting a wife. They were practical documents written in a hand that was forceful without being showy, describing the ranch and the land and the nature of the work and the qualities that would be required of a person who intended to make a life there. They described the root cellar and the well in the winter road conditions with the same careful attention that they applied to the sunrise over the eastern ridge on a clear morning in October, or to the particular quality of light that came through the valley in the last weeks before the snow arrived for good. A man who wrote about the sunrise over the eastern ridge in the same letter where he discussed root cellar inventory was not a man writing to impress anyone. He was a man writing because those things mattered to him equally, and he did not distinguish between what was poetic and what was practical, because he lived in a place where those categories did not really separate. Wren had read 6 other advertisements before that one. She had spoken to 2 other men by letter. She had weighed her options with the methodical care of a woman who has learned that decisions made in haste are decisions made twice. But it was the letters that had decided her. Not the content of any single one, but the cumulative picture they built of a person who paid attention, who kept his word in matters large and small, who believed that a thing worth doing was worth describing accurately. She had come to Montana because of Silas Holt's letters. She had not told him that. She was not sure she intended to, at least not yet. Inside the house was everything the letters had described, and nothing that the word comfortable, in its ordinary sense, would account for. It was large and solidly built, with thick log walls that held the cold at bay, and a stone fireplace wide enough to stand in, currently burning with a fire that had been banked down to coals sometime in the afternoon and was now being coaxed back to life by the question of who was going to do it. Wren did it. She found the iron poker and worked the coals and added 2 split logs from the pile beside the hearth before anyone had decided whether to offer or instruct. And the fire responded with an immediate and grateful enthusiasm that lit the room orange and cast the shadows of three large men against the rough-cut walls in a way that might have seemed menacing if she had allowed herself to think about it that way. She did not. The room was functional, stone floor partially covered by animal skins, a long table built from planks heavy and without ornament, four chairs mismatched, a shelf along the far wall holding canned goods and tools and several books that she noted for later. No curtains on the windows, no softness anywhere that was not the softness of necessity, a wool blanket draped over the back of one chair, a scrap of braided rug near the door. It was a house built entirely around the demands of survival. It contained nothing that was not useful, and it contained nothing that was beautiful for its own sake. And it was the least personal space Wren had inhabited since she was a child in a church dormitory, being raised on charity and routine. She felt standing in the middle of it, something she had not expected to feel. She felt like she understood it. Silas set her bag near the door to the East Hall and then stood with his hands loose at his sides and his amber eyes on her face, and he said the only thing he had apparently decided to say at this juncture. "East room is yours. Warmest in winter faces the sunrise. You'll take meals with us. You'll manage the kitchen and the supply stores. We'll handle the ranch work." A pause. The arrangement is formal. Amos Marsh at the church in Ridgeback has the document. Everything is accounted for. And the term, Wren asked, through spring, April when the road opens, reliable. Another pause, this one slightly longer. If you want to leave, then you leave. If you want to stay, we talk about what comes next. Ford was sitting at the table now, his long legs stretched out, watching this exchange with the particular attention of a man who has given up pretending he is not paying attention. "6 people before you didn't make it to spring," he said. "I know, Stuano," Wren said. "I asked the agency about the previous placements before I agreed to come." The silence that followed this was the kind that happens when 3 people are recalibrated simultaneously. Abel, who had been standing near the window since they came in, looked up from the floor for the first time and fixed his gray eyes on her face. "What did they tell you?" he asked. It was the first time he had spoken, and his voice was quieter than she had expected. Not soft exactly, but measured like a man who speaks only when the words are worth the expenditure. "Enough," Wren said. "Name. They told me enough." Then she picked up her carpet bag and walked down the East Hall to find her room, and she left the 3 of them standing in the firelight with the particular expression of men who have just had the conversational ground shifted under them and have not yet decided whether that is alarming or interesting. The East Room was simple and cold and smelled faintly of pine resin and wood smoke. A bed with a rope frame and a straw mattress and 2 heavy quilts folded at the foot. A washstand with a ceramic basin, a small table with a tallow candle, a window that looked out in the last gray light of the November afternoon over the eastern ridge of the mountain, which was exactly where Silas had written that the sunrise would be visible on a clear morning. Wren set her bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed. She was tired. The journey had been 3 weeks long and had involved 5 separate conveyances in 2 nights in way stations that had tested her tolerance for discomfort in the specific way that places test you when they are cold and the beds are thin and the people around you are strangers with no investment in your comfort. She was tired, but she was not afraid. Fear was something she had examined at length during the weeks of travel, holding it up to the light and looking at it from different angles, trying to understand its actual dimensions. She had found it smaller than she expected. She had found at the bottom of it not the terror of the unknown, but something simpler and more bearable. The awareness that she was betting everything she had on a decision that could not be undone. She had made irreversible decisions before. She knew what they felt like. They felt like this, like the particular quiet that comes after you have chosen a direction and started moving, and there is nothing behind you but the road you have already traveled. She opened the top drawer of the small dresser beside the washstand, intending to put away her few personal items. She stopped. In the back of the drawer, half hidden under a fold of old newspaper that someone had used to line the bottom, was a ring. Small silver or silver-colored, tarnished to the color of a storm cloud. No stone, no engraving, just a band worn smooth on the inside from extended use. Wren held it in her palm, looked at it for a long moment. It had not been forgotten. No one forgets a ring in a drawer. It had been left. There was a difference, and the difference had weight. Someone had put this ring in this drawer and then walked away from it. And that told a story that the agency's careful omissions had not. She placed it gently back under the newspaper and finished unpacking. She did not mention the ring at supper. She did not intend to mention it for some time. She was a woman who understood that questions answered too early give you information. Questions held until the right moment give you understanding. Supper was elk stew that Ford had apparently started that afternoon. Dark and rich and better than she had expected from a man who did everything with the efficient grace of someone who has never once been impressed by his own abilities. They ate mostly in silence, which was not uncomfortable, the way silence is uncomfortable when it is a punishment or an evasion. It was the silence of people who have spent enough time in their own company that conversation is a choice rather than an obligation. Wren ate her portion and said very little. She was watching and cataloging, which was what she had always done in new environments. She had learned in 6 years of teaching other people's children in other people's houses to read a room by its details rather than its declarations. Silas ate with his eyes on his bowl and his posture suggesting the sustained attention of a man whose mind was working even when his body was still. Ford ate quickly and without ceremony, and then sat back with his arms crossed and watched her with the unconcealed curiosity of someone who has not yet decided whether to trust what he is seeing. Abel ate slowly and did not look at her directly and did not look away either, which she understood eventually was not rudeness, but observation, the kind of comprehensive, unobtrusive attention that she associated with people who have trained themselves to see clearly by practicing being unseen. After supper, Silas stood and said simply, "Door at the end of the hall locks from inside," and then went to sit by the fire with a ledger book. And that was the entirety of the evening's social architecture. Ford washed the bowls without being asked, which surprised her, and then shrugged when she glanced at him. Women who came before didn't last long enough to establish habits, he said, so we kept our own. You could keep them anyway, she said, even if I stay. He looked at her with the pale green eyes for a long beat. Could, he said, and then dried his hands and went to bed without further elaboration. Abel had already gone. She had not noticed him leave. Wren sat for a short time alone in the firelight, listening to the house settle around her, listening to the wind beginning outside, and she thought about the ring in the drawer, and the letters in her memory, and the 3 men in their separate rooms, and the mountain pressing down on all of them with its particular and indifferent authority. Then she went to her room. She noted without particular drama that she did not lock the door. The first week at Holt's Ridge established the terms of the relationships with an efficiency that surprised her. With Silas, the language was silence used purposefully. He rose at 4:30 every morning that without fail, and by the third day she was rising at 4:15 to have the fire built, and the coffee started before he came out of his room, and on the fourth morning she found him already at the table with 2 cups poured, and he looked at her when she sat down with an expression that was not a smile but was something in the same latitude as one. And they drank their coffee in the half-dark for 15 minutes before the sun began to consider the eastern ridge. And in that silence, she learned more about him than she would have in an hour of conversation. He was a man who had been paying attention to the world for a very long time and had very little to prove by talking about it. The silence was not emptiness. It was density, the silence of a man whose inner life was considerable and whose relationship with external expression was simply very selective. With Ford, the language was information delivered with the bluntness of a man who has long since stopped filtering his observations through the social requirement to make them palatable. He told her on the second day that the roof over the north storage room needed attention before January. He told her on the third day that the mare called Copper had a problem with her left rear leg that had been developing since September and was worth monitoring. He told her on the fourth day that the previous women had all made the same mistake of assuming that winter in Montana was a variation on winter anywhere else, and that it was not. Each piece of information was useful. Each piece of information was, when she thought about it, a form of preparation, a man with no gift for gentleness, trying to give her what she needed to survive in the only way he knew how to give it. She received all of it without complaint and used what was useful and filed what required time to be useful, and she noticed that Ford watched her receive it with a kind of grudging recalibration that she recognized as the beginning of respect, being assigned to someone he had not expected to earn it. With Abel, the language was attention itself. He watched without seeming to watch. He did things before being asked to do them in ways that suggested he had already anticipated the need. On the fifth morning, she came into the kitchen and found on the table a folded piece of paper, and inside was a pencil drawing, careful and precise, of the ranch as seen from the eastern ridge, with small notations in a close, clear, hand-root cellar northeast of main barn. Well close and from mid-November. Emergency route and storm east fence line to large barn. It was a map, a survival map drawn without ceremony and left without explanation. She would not know until later that Abel had not made this map for anyone who had come before her. On Saturday of the first week, Drummond's stagecoach came rattling along the mountain road on its regular circuit. He pulled the horses up and looked at Wren, who was in the side yard splitting kindling with a small hatchet she had found on the porch, and appropriated on the grounds that it was not being used, and she needed it. "I can take you back," he said, and his voice was not unkind. "No charge. I've said it to all of them." Wren brought the hatchet down and split a piece of pine into 4 sections with 2 clean strokes. "What day is it, Drummond?" "Saturday." "I was hired through spring." She stacked the kindling without looking up. "The spring hasn't happened yet." Drummond sat with that for a moment. Then he slapped the reins and continued down the road, and there was something in the set of his shoulders as he drove away that suggested a man revising a long-held opinion. From the window of the front room, Silas Holt watched. He had been watching all week in the way that he watched everything, with the patient and total attention of a man who has learned that the world reveals itself to those who give it enough time and enough quiet observation. He had watched her build fires correctly on the first try. He had watched her reorganize the supply shelf in a way that made the inventory immediately visible and logical, a thing he had meant to do for 2 years and never gotten around to. He had watched her speak to Ford without backing down, which no one else had managed in recent memory. He had watched her read the map Abel made her and say nothing about it to anyone, which was exactly the right response. He had watched her, and he had come to a conclusion that was both simple and unsettling. She was not like the others. He was not yet sure what to do with this information. He was a man who proceeded carefully, who did not revise his positions without evidence, who did not allow himself to want things he had not yet determined were reasonable to want. He had spent 4 years building a life organized around the absence of a certain kind of hope, and he was not going to dismantle that architecture in a week based on the behavior of a woman who split kindling without being asked. But he had watched her tell Drummond she was staying, and something in his chest, in the vicinity of a door he had closed carefully and locked from the inside, had shifted, very slightly. The way a door shifts when someone on the other side leans against it, not forcing it open, just reminding it that there is pressure on the other side. He turned away from the window and went back to the ledger. He sat down. He picked up the pen. He did not write anything for several minutes. That night, after the fire had been banked and the house had gone quiet, Wren lay in the east room and listened to the wind increase against the window glass and thought about the ring in the drawer. She thought about the 6 women who had come before her. She thought about what the agency had told her, which was that the placements had not worked out due to incompatibility of expectations, which was the language that institutions use when the truth is both more complicated and more human than a formal explanation can accommodate. She had pressed the clerk, a small, apologetic man named Hendricks, for more detail. He had given it reluctantly, in the manner of a man releasing information against his better professional judgment, because the woman asking him had a quality of patient, immovable expectation that made evasion feel more exhausting than honesty. The first three women had left because of the isolation and the silence and the sheer physical severity of the environment. These were reasonable responses to unreasonable conditions. The fourth woman, a widow named Serafina Vance, had lasted 3 weeks, which was the longest run of anyone before Wren. She had not left because of the cold or the silence or the isolation. She had left because she had found something out, and what she had found had frightened her. Hendricks had not told Wren what that something was. She had not asked him to. She was a woman who knew how to wait for information to arrive at its natural time rather than forcing it into premature disclosure. And she understood that the thing Serafina Vance had discovered was still here, still living in the walls of Holt's Ridge, like heat stored in stone, and it would reveal itself when it was ready. She closed her eyes. Outside the window, the first serious snow of the season was beginning to fall quiet and without ceremony, the way the mountain announced its intentions when it was not asking permission. Wren listened to it for a while. Then she slept. She slept without locking the door. The second week brought snow in earnest, and with the snow, the first real test of what she was made of. It was Ford who provided the test because Ford provided most of the tests at Holt's Ridge, not out of malice, but because he was constitutionally incapable of allowing things to remain at the surface level when there was a deeper level available. He came into the kitchen on the 9th morning while she was working through the supply inventory, cataloging what they had and what they lacked and what they would need before the road became unreliable. And he stood in the doorway and watched her work for a moment and then said, "You're counting wrong." She did not look up. "I'm not counting wrong. The dried beans in the back are half what the ledger says. Ledger hasn't been updated since August." She set down the pencil and looked at him. He was right. She had noticed the discrepancy and had been about to address it. The particular frustration of his observation was not that it was incorrect, but that it was correct and delivered in the specific tone of a man who is not accustomed to women who notice things before being told to notice them. "I know," she said. "I was going to note it. We'll run short before February if we don't adjust." "I'm aware." She picked the pencil up again. "That's what I'm calculating." Ford stood in the doorway for a long moment. She could feel him reassessing the way she had learned to feel reassessment in a room, a slight shift in the quality of attention directed toward her. "What do you need from town?" he asked finally. "A list," she said, "which I'll have for you by this evening." He left. She heard him in the main room saying something to Silas in a voice too low to make out, and she heard Silas's response, which was single syllable, and told her nothing, and she went back to counting beans. By evening, she had the list. It was comprehensive and organized by category and included at the bottom 3 items that she had added on the grounds that they would improve the winter considerably and that the budget she had reviewed in the ledger could accommodate them. A bolt of wool fabric, 2 pounds of candle tallow, a set of iron hooks for the kitchen wall that would increase the usable hanging space by considerable margin. She handed the list to Silas, who read it in the firelight with the concentrated attention he gave to everything. And when he reached the bottom section, his expression shifted very slightly, which was she was learning his equivalent of a raised eyebrow. "The hooks," he said. "The pots are stacked on the floor," she said. "It's inefficient, and it's a hazard when the floor is wet." A pause. "The fabric." Ford's coat has a tear at the left shoulder seam that will widen significantly if it isn't mended before serious cold. I can see it from across the room. The existing thread won't hold a repair through February." Another pause, slightly longer. "You've been here 9 days, he said. "I look at things carefully," she said. He folded the list and put it in his shirt pocket. "We'll ride to Ridgeback Thursday if the road holds him," he said. And that was the entirety of the response. It was enough. On the 10th night, she woke at 2:30 to what she could only describe in the moment of waking as wrongness. Not a sound exactly. An absence of sound where there had been sound. A change in the breathing of the house. She lay still and listened. Then she heard it. From down the hall, from the direction of the room she had identified as Ford's. the sound that careful walls and cautious men make when they believe no one is listening. It was low and controlled, the sound of grief that has been practiced into something almost indistinguishable from silence. The kind of crying that belongs to a person who has spent years learning to make it inaudible and has never quite succeeded. It stopped after a few minutes. The house settled back into quiet. Wren lay in the dark and did not move for a long time. She thought about the ring. She thought about the portrait she had noticed turned face first against the wall in the storage hall, which she had not touched. She thought about the way Abel flinched when anyone mentioned the town of Ridgeback in a particular kind of context, the context of people and history rather than commerce and geography. She thought about the fourth woman, Seraphina Vance. 3 weeks, which was the longest anyone had lasted before her. Left because of what she found out. The Holt brothers were not mysterious men in the way that men are sometimes mysterious, which is the mystery of theater of deliberate opacity maintained for the purpose of seeming interesting. They were mysterious in the way that mountains are mysterious, which is the mystery of something that is exactly what it appears to be and has simply not yet revealed all of its surface. She did not yet know what was underneath, but she was beginning to understand the shape of it, and the shape was not frightening. The shape was Guifam. The shape was 3 men who had been broken by something specific and had rebuilt themselves around the absence of whatever had broken them, and who were in their different ways managing to continue forward with extraordinary capability and very little acknowledgement that the absence was still there. She had taught children for 6 years. She knew what it looked like when someone was carrying something heavy and had decided that the only option was to carry it indefinitely. She went back to sleep. In the morning, she made biscuits from scratch, which filled the kitchen with a warmth and a smell that did not belong to survival or efficiency, but to something older and simpler. And she watched the 3 Holt brothers come to the table one at a time and sit down with the slightly uncertain air of men who have just encountered something their defenses were not configured to handle. Ford ate 4 biscuits without commenting on them. For Ford, this was the most effusive possible response. Abel ate 2 and then looked at her with the gray, watchful eyes and said, "Our mother used to make these." The room went quiet in a different way than its ordinary quiet. Silas set down his coffee cup, looked at Abel, looked at the table, said nothing. Wren said, "I can teach anyone who wants to learn." No one responded, but something had shifted in the room. Something small, insignificant, and she filed it the way she filed everything carefully for later. By the end of the 2nd week, Drummond's regular circuit brought him past Holt's Ridge again on Saturday morning, and he pulled his horses up, as he always did out of a habit, formed over 6 prior runs, and looked for the woman by the gate. She was in the side yard stacking the wood that Abel had split that morning, organizing it by size against the wall of the house in a configuration that would allow the longest pieces to dry while the shorter ones remained accessible through the narrow gap between the woodpile and the building's overhang. She looked up when she heard the horses. "Still here," she said. Drummond sat with this. "So I see." She went back to stacking. He drove on. From the main room window, Silas watched the stagecoach disappear around the bend in the road. He stood for a long moment, and the amber eyes did something that they did not often do, which was to allow the interior of what he was thinking to be briefly visible. Then he turned back to the room and to the work of the day, and to the slow, difficult, unfamiliar process of beginning to reconsider whether the wall he had built around himself was as necessary as he had believed when he started building it. He went to the kitchen and poured 2 cups of coffee. He set one at Wren's place at the table. When she came in from the yard cold-cheeked and with wood dust on her coat, she looked at the cup and then looked at him. He was already at the door, headed back to the barn. She sat down and wrapped her hands around the warm cup and looked out the window at the mountain, and the hint of a smile that crossed her face was not triumph and was not relief. It was simply the expression of a woman who recognizes a language she knows being spoken in a new dialect and is glad to find that communication is possible after all. She had lasted 2 weeks. She intended to last considerably longer than that. And in the East Room drawer, under a fold of old newspaper, The silver ring waited with the patience of things that had been left behind by people who did not know that what they left was not the end of a story, but the beginning of someone else's. The third week arrived with a cold that was different in quality from what had come before. The cold of the first 2 weeks had been the cold of a season settling in a gradual lowering of temperature that a body from the eastern cities could adapt to if it was willing to adapt. This new cold was different. It came from the north with a particular authority, the kind of cold that does not negotiate, that enters through every gap and crack in a building's armor and makes its presence felt in the bones before it registers in the skin. The kind of cold that the Holt brothers acknowledged by adding a second log to the fire in the evening without discussion, which Wren understood was the frontier equivalent of sounding a general alarm. She adapted. She had always adapted. It was the central skill of a life lived in borrowed spaces. She began rising at 4 in the morning instead of 4:15, which gave her time to build the fire in the main room and the kitchen simultaneously before Silas emerged from his room. And the first morning she managed this, he came out to find both fires already burning and coffee already hot, and stood in the hallway for a moment with an expression. She was beginning to recognize the expression of a man who is being quietly outmaneuvered and is deciding how he feels about it. He felt she would learn gradually something in the neighborhood of relief. Not that he would have said so, not in those words, not in any words, not yet. But there is a way that a man's shoulders change when something he has been holding in tension is permitted to release just slightly, just enough. And Silas Holt's shoulders did that in the hallway on the morning of the third week when he found the fires already built and the coffee already poured. She noticed. She said nothing. This was the essential grammar of her relationship with Silas. In those early weeks, she noticed everything and said almost nothing, and he did the same. And what passed between them in the space of that mutual and careful attention was more substantial than most of the conversations she had witnessed in the drawing rooms of Philadelphia. The snow deepened through the third week. Abel had been right about November 15th and the well, which froze over on the 14th and required breaking every morning with a long iron bar that lived propped beside the well housing for exactly this purpose. Ford demonstrated the technique once with the efficient economy of a man who performs a task so many times it becomes invisible to him. And Wren watched and performed it herself the following morning before he was out of the barn, and Ford came around the corner of the house to find her already done and heading inside with the water bucket. He stood by the well housing for a moment. "Efficient," he said. "That is the second time someone has used that word about me this week," she said without stopping. "Who was the first?" She did not answer. She heard him laugh short and surprised, and she kept walking. The supply run to Ridgeback that Silas had promised happened on Thursday of the third week, and it was on this trip, sitting in the back of the ranch wagon, with the cold air pressing down on everything and the mountains rising on three sides, that Wren first understood the particular quality of isolation that the high country produced. The road to Ridgeback was 12 miles of frozen ruts through pine forest and open meadow, and they passed no other habitation for the first 9 miles, and the silence of it was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of scale of a landscape so large and so indifferent that the passage of a wagon and 3 people through it left no mark whatsoever. Silas drove. Ford rode alongside on horseback. Wren sat in the wagon bed with a wool blanket over her knees and watched the country go by and thought for the first time with real specificity about what it would mean to spend a winter here. Not as an idea, not as an arrangement on paper, as a physical reality. 12 miles from town, 4 miles from the nearest neighbor. 5 months of snow, more or less, depending on the year and the mountain's inclination. She had known this in the abstract. She had read it in the letters and in the agency's documentation and had understood it the way that a person understands something they have not yet experienced. Now she understood it with her body, with the cold that was working through the wool blanket and into her legs, with the sound of the runners on the frozen road and the vast, patient silence of the forest on either side. She was not frightened. She was something else, something that lived in the same territory as frightened, but was oriented differently. She was awake to things in a way she had not been awake in years. The cold was real. The distance was real. The three men she had agreed to build a life with were real, increasingly and specifically real, in ways that the abstract category of mountain men from a Philadelphia agency file had not prepared her for. She realized, paying attention in a way that had nothing to do with survival strategy. She was paying attention because everything she was looking at was worth paying attention to. Ridgeback was a town of 400 people and 12 commercial establishments and a church with a bell tower that could be heard on quiet mornings from 2 miles outside of town. They spent 3 hours there. Silas negotiated the supply purchases at the general store with the focused brevity of a man for whom commerce is a necessary imposition on the real work of the day. Ford carried things and made occasional dry observations about the prices of things that no one responded to. Abel, who had come after all, walked the perimeter of the town with the quiet attention of a man taking inventory. Wren went to the church. She did not go inside. She stood at the edge of the churchyard and looked at the building and thought about what Silas had said on the first night that Amos Marsh at the church in Ridgeback had the formal document of their arrangement on file. She thought about what a document on file meant in practical terms, which was that someone external to Holt's Ridge had a record of the situation, that the arrangement was witnessed, informal, and therefore carried a certain protection for everyone involved, including her. She thought about what it would mean to convert that arrangement into something permanent, what it would require from her, what it would require from the men. She was 23 years old. She had been making her own decisions since she was 17 and had no one else available to make them. She was not afraid of permanence. She was, if anything, more afraid of its opposite, of the kind of life that is always provisional, always waiting for the next displacement, always carrying the low-grade dread of a woman who knows that her position in any household is contingent on circumstances she cannot fully control. Permanence required commitment from both sides. She understood this. She was not yet sure whether the men of Holt's Ridge were capable of commitment in the way she meant it, which was not the commitment of a formal document, but the commitment of the interior, the decision made in the place where a person decides things that matter. She was watching to find out. She went back to the general store and helped Silas load the wagon with the efficiency she was learning her primary currency in this new world. And on the ride back up the mountain, she sat in the wagon bed with the supplies and the bolt of wool fabric and the iron hooks and watched the sky go dark over the ridgeline and felt the temperature drop another 3 degrees in the space of an hour. Ford rode beside the wagon and said at one point without preamble, "You didn't complain once today." She looked up at him. Was there something worth complaining about? He thought about this with the genuine seriousness he applied to most questions. Cold, long ride, lot of standing around waiting on things. I've had worse days. What kind of days? She looked at the mountain ahead of them at the ridgeline, where the last of the light was holding its position before conceding to the dark. Days where I didn't know whether I was going to have a position the following week, she said. Days where I had to decide whether I could afford the coal or the food, but not both. Days where the people I worked for made it clear in small ways and large ones that I was there at their convenience and could be removed from their convenience at any time. Ford was quiet for a moment. Agency said you were a teacher. I was. The school closed. Before that, a governess for 3 different families over 4 years. And she looked at him. He was watching her with the pale green eyes and the particular attention of a man who asks questions because he actually wants the answers, which was rarer than people admitted. And each of those positions ended when it stopped being convenient for someone else that I held it, she said. None of those endings had anything to do with my performance. They had to do with circumstances that were not mine to manage. A pause. I came here because the arrangement in Silas's letters was the first one I had encountered in 6 years, where the terms were explicit and the expectations were stated, and nobody was pretending that anything was different from what it was. Ford rode beside the wagon for a while after that without speaking. The horse's breath made clouds in the cold air, and the pine trees on either side of the road held their snow-covered arms out over the road like something between a shelter and a weight. "The others," he said finally, "the women before you, they came looking for something different." "I know," she said. "What were they looking for?" She considered the question honestly. "Some of them were looking for rescue," she said. "Some were looking for simplicity, which is not the same thing as hard work, and they discovered this too late. Some were looking for a man to be something he wasn't." A pause. "I think they were all in different ways looking for something the arrangement could not actually deliver. And when they discovered that, they left." "What are you looking for?" The wagon hit a rut, and she put her hand on the sideboard to steady herself. Above them, the first stars were becoming visible in the darkening sky, sharp and cold, and impossibly numerous. "A place to be," she said. "That's all. A place where I'm not conditional." Ford said nothing more for the rest of the ride, but something in his posture, the set of his shoulders on the horse, the angle of his head had shifted in the way that things shift when a person files something away in the part of themselves where they keep things that matter. They unloaded the wagon by lantern light. Silas worked with the steady, unhurried efficiency that was his default mode. Ford stacked the heavier supplies with a speed that made the work look effortless. Abel arranged the hooks that Wren had requested in the kitchen with a precision that suggested he had already worked out the optimal placement before she had specified one. When the hooks were installed and the cookpots were hanging where they were supposed to hang, and the kitchen had the organized, functional look that Wren had been working toward since the first day Abel stood back and looked at it. "Better," he said, not to her specifically, "to the room." "Much better," she agreed. He looked at her, then the gray eyes direct and measuring. "You do that," he said. "Do what improve things." A pause. "Without making it about improving things." She was not entirely sure what he meant, but she thought she understood it, and it was the closest to a compliment that Abel Holt had yet offered, and she received it quietly and without flourish, because she understood that flourish would ruin it. The fourth week brought the first serious conflict, and it came from the direction she had least expected, which was her own initiative. She had been teaching reading to the boy. His name was Ellsworth, the 9-year-old son of a rancher named Breckenridge, whose property sat 4 miles down the mountain road, and he came by twice a week on errands. His father sent him on errands that always seemed to bring him past Holt's Ridge. At times that coincided with the kitchen being warm and the smell of something baking being detectable from the road. She had started giving him biscuits on his second visit, and on his third visit, she had noticed that he was looking at the books on the shelf in the main room with the particular hungry attention of a child who has been told that books exist but has not been given meaningful access to them. She had taken down the simplest of the books and spent 20 minutes showing him the letters in his name. By the fourth week, Ellsworth came by twice a week, and they spent an hour together at the kitchen table, and he was progressing with the speed of a child who has been waiting for this and did not know he was waiting until it arrived. Ford found out on a Tuesday. He came into the kitchen for water and found Wren and the Breckenridge boy at the table with the primer and a slate, and his expression went through several stages in rapid succession. He waited until Ellsworth had gone home before he spoke. "You didn't ask," he said. "No," she said, "I didn't. People coming and going from this property is a consideration. A 9-year-old boy doing his father's errands is not a security consideration. That's not your determination to make." She set down the dish she was drying and looked at him. "He cannot read his own name, Ford. He is 9 years old. His father is 4 miles down a mountain road and doesn't have time to teach him, and there is no school within 15 miles. The determination of whether I help him is absolutely mine to make. This is our... I am not a prisoner." Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. There was a quality of absolute steadiness in it that was in its own way louder than volume. "I am a woman doing a job in exchange for fair terms. One of the things I am qualified to do is teach. I am teaching. If you have a substantive objection that is not about control for its own sake, I am willing to hear it." Ford's jaw set. The green eyes were sharp with something that was not quite anger and was not quite its opposite. He was a man who was not accustomed to the specific kind of resistance that does not back down and does not escalate, that simply holds its position without apology. He opened his mouth. Silas said from the doorway, without looking up from the rope he was recoiling. "She is not wrong, Ford." The kitchen went very quiet. Ford looked at his oldest brother. Something passed between them. The compressed communication of men who have lived together long enough that certain arguments can be conducted in a glance. And this argument concluded with Ford setting his water cup down with a precision that was its own kind of statement and walking back out the door. That evening, Wren found a stack of firewood by the kitchen step. It was nearly twice the normal quantity, each piece split to the exact size she preferred for the kitchen stove. She had mentioned this preference once in passing 4 days earlier. She stood looking at it for a moment in the cold evening air. Then she brought it inside piece by piece and stacked it against the kitchen wall. The following morning, Ford came to the kitchen for breakfast, and she gave him an extra biscuit without comment. He ate it without comment. The matter was closed in the way that the Holtz close matters, without ceremony and without lingering. She was learning their language. Not just the language of silence and the language of information delivered bluntly, and the language of attention sustained without declaration. She was learning the language underneath all of those, the language that had been built over 4 years of men living together in the absence of something that had once been present. There was grief in this house. It lived in the rooms the way cold lives in stone walls, not visible, not dramatic, present in a way that you felt before you understood it. Wren had grown up in the vicinity of grief. She had been motherless at 17 and had managed the transition without the luxury of being unable to function, because function had been the only alternative to collapse, and collapse had not been affordable. She knew the shape of grief that had been managed into something operational. She knew the particular way it manifested in people who had decided to continue forward regardless of it. She had seen it in Silas since the first day, in the careful economy of a man who has removed from his life everything that was not load-bearing. She had heard it in Ford's room in the middle of the second week, that low and practiced grief that had been disciplined into near silence. She sensed it in Abel most acutely in the watchfulness of a young man who has assigned himself the role of witness because he does not trust himself to be anything else. On the 17th evening, when Silas and Ford had retired early, and the main room held only the fire and the sound of the wind outside, Abel was at the table with his sketchbook, and Wren was in the chair by the fire with a mending project, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind that takes time to build between people and cannot be manufactured. Abel said, without looking up from his drawing, "What did you teach in Philadelphia?" "Reading, writing, arithmetic. Geography sometimes when the children were interested." "Were they interested?" "Some of them. The ones who understood that a map was not just a picture, but a record of how someone had seen the world at a particular moment." Abel looked up. "That's an unusual way to describe a map." "It's what they are, though. Someone decided what mattered enough to put down on paper. Someone decided what the boundaries were and where the rivers ran and what the names of things were. All of that is a choice. Maps are arguments about the world." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with the gray eyes that missed nothing. "I never thought about them that way." "What do you think about them as?" "Instructions," he said. "How to get from one place to another without getting lost." "That too," she said. "Both things are true at once." He went back to his drawing. She went back to her mending. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls with a persistence that was becoming familiar, the mountain making itself known in the only language it had. After a while, Abel said, "Our mother used to say that every place has a story, and most people are too busy moving through places to hear it." The fire crackled. The wind pushed against the north window. "She sounds like she was worth listening to," Wren said carefully. She was. A pause, the precise length of a pause in which a person decides how much more to say. "She died 4 winters ago. Fever. It took her in 8 days. Another pause. "I was the only one here. Silas and Ford were at the lower ranch 2 days' ride down. By the time they knew there was nothing to be done. The room held this information quietly. Abel, Wren said. He looked up. You were 22 years old. He said nothing, but something in his face and the careful, measured stillness of it shifted slightly the way ice shifts at the first warmth of spring, barely perceptible, but irreversible. A 22-year-old should not have to carry what you've been carrying, she said. It wasn't your failure, it was a fever. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back at his drawing. Silas has never said that, he said. Silas carries his own weight and doesn't always have hands free for anyone else's, she said. That doesn't mean he doesn't know. They sat in the silence for a while longer. When Abel finally went to bed, he paused in the doorway of the main room and looked back at her. The women before you, he said. I drew all of them. When they were here. He paused. I haven't opened that book since the last one left. He went to his room. She sat with the fire for a while after that, and what she felt in the sitting was not triumph or satisfaction, but something quieter and more serious. The feeling of having been admitted to a room that had been locked for a long time, and understanding that this admission came with responsibilities she intended to honor. She had been at Holt's Ridge for 4 weeks when she found the portrait. It was in the storage hall, the narrow passage between the main room and the rear of the house, where tools and seasonal equipment were kept. She had gone to find a length of chain that Silas had mentioned was somewhere in the back, and she was working her way through the organized disorder of a space that stored everything necessary and nothing else when her lantern fell on the portrait. It was propped against the wall at the end of the hall, face inward. The frame was simple wood, handmade, and the canvas was turned so that only the stretcher bars and the backing were visible. It had been positioned there with a deliberateness that was distinct from the casual leaving behind of things that are simply not needed at the moment. It had been placed there, intentionally, at a distance from the rooms where people lived. She set the lantern down and crouched beside it. She did not turn it around. She thought about turning it around. She thought about it for a full 30 seconds, long enough to have actually done it twice. Instead, she looked at the back of the canvas, where someone had written in the corner in ink, now faded to a pale brown, a single word. The word was a name. She straightened up, picked up the lantern, and found the chain she had come for. She went back to the main room and said nothing about the portrait to anyone. But she had seen the name, and she carried it with her from that point forward, the way she carried everything that would eventually matter, carefully with patience, waiting for the moment when it would join the rest of what she was learning to form a complete picture. The name on the back of the canvas was Constance. The last week of November arrived with a change in the air that all 3 Holt brothers recognized before Wren could name it. It was a pressure change, something in the quality of the cold, a particular stillness in the forest that Abel described only as storm coming, a real one, in which Silas responded to by spending 48 hours in intensified preparation without explaining the preparation to her, which she did not require because she had been watching the preparation and understanding its purpose since the first of his movements toward the woodpile. They moved the remaining cattle to the covered barn. They checked the window casings on the north side of the house. Silas brought down from the upper shelves in the storage room 2 additional supply caches that Wren had not known were up there, carefully preserved provisions that had been put away with the methodical foresight of a man who plans for the worst and does not feel embarrassed about it. Wren reorganized the kitchen stores to account for the additional supply. She mapped out a rationing schedule in the small notebook she had brought from Philadelphia. Not dramatic rationing, not the rationing of deprivation, but the sensible adjustment of consumption to duration that a person learns to do when they grow up with an uncertain relationship to plenty. She calculated 7 weeks at current consumption for 4 people, which was more than sufficient for any storm. She revised this downward slightly to account for the increased caloric demands of men doing heavy physical labor in extreme cold, and revised it back up slightly to account for her own lower requirements, and arrived at a number she was satisfied with. She said nothing about the notebook or the calculation to anyone. She simply knew the number and adjusted her cooking accordingly in ways that were subtle enough that no one would notice the management, but would benefit from it. The storm arrived on the 22nd of November. It did not arrive the way that storms arrive in descriptions written by people who have not experienced the serious weather of the high country with drama and warning. It arrived the way the most serious things arrive, with a quiet intensity that was almost slow at first, the snow coming sideways before you fully registered that it was not coming straight down. The temperature dropping in a way that felt gradual until you realized that 20 degrees had gone in an hour, and the air outside was now capable of serious harm in minutes. By noon of the first day, the road to Ridgeback was not a road. It was a feature of the landscape that was no longer distinguishable from the surrounding landscape. The door on the north side of the house could not be opened because the drift against it had reached the top of the doorframe. The barn was visible from the kitchen window, barely a dark shape in a white absence that extended in all directions without horizon or reference point. They were sealed in. Wren had expected this to feel like confinement. It did not feel like confinement. It felt in the strange way that extreme circumstances sometimes produce unexpected emotional results, like something settling into place. The storm removed the theoretical possibility of departure that had been an unspoken presence in the background of every day at Holt's Ridge. There was nowhere to go. There was only here, these rooms, these fires, these four people, and the mountain pressing down on all sides with the absolute authority of a thing that is not interested in your preferences. The first day of the storm established a new kind of proximity. Ford paced. She had known he would pace. He was a man whose emotional management was physical, who processed difficulty through movement, and confinement was the specific condition most likely to cause him to press against his own limits. By mid-afternoon, he had sharpened every blade in the house and had begun on the axe heads, and there was a quality to the sharpening that was less about the blades and more about the need for his hands to be doing something purposeful. Silas sat by the east window and looked out at the white nothing and did not speak for 3 hours, which was not unusual for Silas, except that the quality of the silence was different. It was not the productive silence of a man whose thoughts were organized and moving forward. It was the tight silence of a man holding himself very still, because stillness was the only available form of control. Abel read, or he appeared to read. She watched him in the careful peripheral way that she watched things she did not want to be seen watching, and she noted that his eyes stopped moving on the page for long stretches, and that the stillness in his face had a particular quality, the quality of someone maintaining composure around a thought that resists composure. She cooked. She cooked not because there was nothing else to do, but because cooking in that kitchen and on that day was the most useful thing available to her. It was the thing that kept the room warm and the air good and gave the passage of hours a structure that the closed-in gray of the storm outside was working to dissolve. She made a soup from the elk meat and the dried beans and the preserved onions, thick and dark and smelling of the kind of warmth that has nothing to do with temperature. She made cornbread. She found at the back of the dry goods shelf a jar of preserved peaches that had been put up in September and set aside, and she opened it and placed it on the table without explanation, because something sweet in the middle of a storm is not a luxury, but a small and important act of resistance against the idea that endurance requires the elimination of pleasure. Ford stopped pacing when the soup was ready. He sat down and ate with the focused appreciation of a man who has been burning energy all day and is grateful for something that will restore it. Silas came to the table from the window with the expression of a man emerging from a Waymon internal distance, and he ate steadily and without comment. Abel closed his book and ate slowly and glanced at the jar of peaches with something that might have been surprise, and then looked at Wren with the gray eyes that were, she was learning, the most honest part of him. "Peaches," he said. "I found them behind the cornmeal," she said. "My mother put those up," he said, "the last summer she was alive." The table was quiet. "Then we should enjoy them properly," Wren said, and she spooned a portion into each of their bowls with a care that was not ceremony, but was something close to it, the recognition that some things deserved to be consumed with attention. They ate the peaches. No one spoke. Outside, the storm pressed against the walls with the focused, impersonal insistence of something that has no opinion about the people inside but will not relent regardless. Later, when the dishes were done and the fire was banked for the night, Wren was in the kitchen when she heard something. She had heard it before on the 10th night from Ford's room, but this was different in direction and different in quality. This sound came from the main room, and it was not grief in the form that grief takes when it has been practiced into near silence. This was something else, a heaviness that was not quite crying and was not quite not crying. The sound of a man sitting in a room with something he cannot set down and cannot carry indefinitely and has not yet found a third option for. She stood very still in the kitchen doorway. Silas was sitting at the table, not by the fire, not by the window, at the table in the direct center of the room with his hands flat on the wood surface and his head bowed slightly, and his eyes on the table and his shoulders in a shape she had not seen them in before, the shape of a man who has let himself be just for a moment the size of what he is actually carrying rather than the size he shows the world. On the table in front of him was a small wooden box that she had noticed. On the mantelpiece had noticed every day and had never touched because some things announce themselves as not ready to be touched. And she had learned to listen to that announcement. The box was open. She could not see what was inside it from the doorway. She did not move for a long moment. She thought about going back to her room. She thought about the ring in the drawer. She thought about the portrait in the hall with the name on the back of the canvas that she had been carrying quietly for a week. Then she walked to the kitchen shelf and took down 2 cups and poured coffee into both of them, the last of the evening's pot warm but no longer hot, and she carried them both to the main room and set one in front of Silas without comment and sat down across from him with her own. He did not look up immediately. She did not require that he look up. She sat and held her cup and waited, and the storm pushed against the house and the fire in the hearth gave out its steady amber light, and enough time passed that the quality of the room began to change the way the quality of air changes when tension finds very slowly a way to release. Silas raised his head. He looked at the coffee cup. He looked at her. His face had the particular exhausted openness of a man who has been holding something in tension for so long that the act of letting it ease feels like a loss of its own kind. Her name was Constance, he said. The storm said nothing. The fire said nothing. Wren said nothing. He closed the box. He did not put it away. He left it on the table between them, present, acknowledged, no longer hidden. My wife, he said. She died 4 years ago, February. It was fast. He looked at his hands flat on the table. She had been here 2 years. She understood this place. She understood what it asked of a person, and she gave it willingly, and she was. He stopped. He started again. She was the kind of person who makes a place make sense, Dimas. The wind moved around the house, finding every seam. The agency doesn't know I was married before, he said. The others didn't know. It seemed. A long pause. I didn't know how to say it without making it a reason for someone to leave before they had even arrived, or a reason to stay for the wrong reasons, Wren said quietly. He looked at her. Someone who knew would either leave because they felt they were second, she said, or stay because they felt they were rescuing you. Neither of those is the right reason. He was quiet for a long moment. What is the right reason? The same reason anyone stays anywhere, she said. Because it's where they belong. The fire burned, the storm pressed. The box sat on the table between them, closed now, but present in a way it had not been permitted to be present before. This was the 4th week at Holt's Ridge, the 27th night, and it was the night that Wren understood that what had driven the previous women away was not the cold or the silence or the isolation, or even in most cases the particular difficulties of the men themselves. It was this: the weight in this house was real, and it was heavy, and it required a person willing to sit with it without trying to fix it or flee from it or pretend it was not the size it was. Seraphina Vance, the woman who had lasted longest, had found this out and left. Wren understood why. Understanding the weight and being willing to remain under it were 2 different capabilities. She intended to remain. Silas, she said when enough time had passed that the words sat in the right kind of silence. The ring in the East Room drawer. He looked at the table. Constance's, he said. She left it there the winter before she died. Said she didn't want to lose it in the cold doing outdoor work. She meant to move it back to the bedroom when the weather warmed. A pause. She didn't get the chance. I found it the first night, Wren said. I put it back where it was. He looked at her then. Why? Because it wasn't mine to move, she said. It was hers, and this was her house, and she should be allowed to have left something in it. Silas Holt looked at the woman sitting across from him in the firelight, with the storm pressing against every wall of the house he had built with his own hands around a life that had been unmade 4 years ago, and something in his face did something it had not done in a very long time. Something opened very slightly in the way that a door opens when the person on the other side is patient enough, and the person on the inside finally accepts that patience is the correct response to patience. He picked up the Kyle cup and drank from it, set it down, looked at the fire. Thank you, he said. 2 words, quiet and specific and containing everything that he did not have the vocabulary yet to say at greater length. You're welcome, she said. They sat until the coffee was done and the fire needed tending, and the storm showed no sign of concluding its business with the mountain, and then they both went to their separate rooms and nothing further was said and nothing further needed to be. In the east room, Wren lay in the dark and listened to the storm and thought about the box on the table and the name on the back of the canvas and the ring under the newspaper in the drawer. And she thought about 3 men who had been building a life around an absence for 4 years. And she thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who could sit in a room with that absence and not run from it. She decided that person, she had always been that person. She had just needed the right circumstances to find it out. Outside, the snow continued falling on Holt's Ridge, with the patient authority of the mountain indifferent and absolute and in its own way honest. It did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. It did not make promises it did not keep. In that sense, she thought drifting towards sleep, it had something in common with the man at the table who had finally said the name he had been carrying for 4 years, and with the house that held his history and hers, and the history of the woman whose ring lay in the drawer, and with the 3 brothers who were each of them, in their different ways, beginning to understand that the woman in the east room was not going to be the 7th woman to leave. She was going to be something else entirely. What that something else was would take more time and more winter and at least one serious test of a kind none of them had yet anticipated. But the understanding was beginning, and in a house where everything had to be earned at understanding was the essential first thing. The storm lasted 4 more days. By the 3rd day, the provisions were holding exactly as she had calculated they would hold, and Copper's condition had become a concern that no one had yet spoken about directly, but that all 4 of them were managing around, and the quality of the confinement had shifted from acute to something more sustainable, a long-burning tension that required management rather than resolution. Ford had stopped pacing. He sat in the evenings and cleaned equipment with the methodical attention of a man converting anxiety into useful work, and Wren noticed that he had positioned his chair so that he could see both the north window and the kitchen doorway, which was not a position he had chosen before the storm, and which told her something about how he managed uncertainty. Abel had put down the book he was not reading and had taken out his sketchbook, and he sat in the evenings drawing with the sustained focus of someone who has found in the act of drawing the same thing that Wren found in the act of cooking a way to be useful to yourself when the external world has temporarily removed the option of being useful to anything else. On the 3rd evening of the storm, he set something on the kitchen table while she was washing the supper dishes. A piece of paper folded in half. She dried her hands and unfolded it. It was a drawing of her, not a portrait exactly, not the studied formality of a portrait, but a sketch made from observation from the specific angle of someone who had been watching from across a room. She was standing at the kitchen stove with her back partly turned. The line of her shoulders, the way her weight was distributed, the particular set of her head when she was thinking about something while doing something else. It was, she realized with a quiet shock, accurate, not flattering, accurate, which was in its way more valuable. She looked up. Abel was at the table with the sketchbook open, not looking at her. "I've drawn everyone who came here," he said, "all 6 of them. I remember you saying that. I stopped looking at that book when the last one left." A pause. "I drew you on the 3rd day." She looked at the sketch again. The 3rd day. She had been 3 days into what she had expected to be the longest and most consequential winter of her life, and Abel Holt had been watching her stand at the stove and had seen something worth drawing. "What did you see?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Someone who was already here," he said. "Not visiting, not waiting to decide, already here." She folded the paper carefully and put it in the pocket of her apron. She went back to the dishes. Outside, the storm pressed on, but it had stopped. Feeling like siege, and had begun to feel like something else, like the particular privacy that extreme weather creates, a forced intimacy that strips away the ordinary distances people maintain and leaves only what is genuinely present. What was genuinely present at Holt's Ridge, she understood by the 4th day of the storm, was the beginning of something she did not yet have a name for. It was not the arrangement that the agency had described. It was not the domestic contract that Silas had outlined on the first night. It was something that had grown up underneath those formal structures in the way that plants grow under snow, invisible and unhurried and entirely committed to reaching the surface when the conditions allowed. The storm broke on the 4th day. Not all at once. Gradually, the way serious things end, the wind first, then the snow slowing and stopping, then the clouds pulling back to reveal a sky of such absolute and painful blue that it seemed to refute the gray days that had preceded it. Silas dug out the door before dawn. She heard the shovel working against the drifts from inside the house, steady and unhurried, and she built the fire and made the coffee and waited. And when he came in with the cold on him and snow in his beard, she handed him a cup, and he stood in the kitchen doorway and drank it and looked at her with the amber eyes that had, over the course of 4 weeks and one extraordinary storm, lost something of their absolute guardedness. Not lost, set aside, temporarily, with the deliberate awareness of a man who knows what he is doing and has decided it is safe to do it. "Road will be passable in 2 days," he said. 3 at the outside. "Good," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer than the exchange required. "You all right?" he asked. It was the first time he had asked her this, the first time he had asked anyone this in longer than he could easily calculate. "Yes," she said, "I am." He nodded once, the single nod that was his signature gesture, and he went to see to the barn, and the horses and Copper's Leg and Wren stood in the kitchen in the flooding winter light, and understood that the storm had done what storms do when you survive them with the right people, which is that it had changed the landscape. Not the landscape outside, though it had changed that too. The landscape inside. The interior geography that of Holt's Ridge had shifted quietly and without announcement, and the distances between things were not quite the same as they had been before the snow. She was 5 weeks in. She was not going anywhere. And somewhere in the house, in the pocket of Abel's coat, and in the memory of a conversation at a table in the middle of a storm, and in the drawer of the East Room where a silver ring sat under a fold of newspaper, the winter was doing what Silas had written about in a letter to a Philadelphia agency 2 years ago, arriving the way it always arrived at Holt's Ridge, completely and without apology, and with the absolute intention of testing everything it touched. Wren Aldgate had been tested before, and she had come through each time by doing the one thing that fear and exhaustion and uncertainty all argue against, which is simply continuing to be exactly who you are, without apology, without revision, without the long backward glance at the road you came from. She had no intention of stopping now. December arrived at Holt's Ridge the way December arrives in the high country of Montana, not as a calendar event, but as a physical fact, a deepening and settling of the cold into something that was no longer seasonal, but structural, as though the mountain had decided that warmth was a temporary arrangement it had tolerated long enough, and was now withdrawing the concession indefinitely. Wren had been at the ranch 5 weeks when the quality of the silence outside the house changed. She noticed it the way she noticed most things, not dramatically, not with the sudden clarity of revelation, but with the quiet accumulation of small observations that eventually assembled themselves into something she could name. The forest beyond the north fence had gone still in a way that was different from its ordinary winter stillness. The dogs that Breckenridge kept at his ranch 4 miles down the mountain, whose barking she had learned to hear on clear mornings as a kind of distant landmark, had gone quiet 2 days running. And Silas, who managed his attention with the disciplined economy of a man who cannot afford to waste it, had been standing at the north window for 20 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon doing nothing at all. She did not ask him about it directly. She had learned that asking Silas directly about something he was not yet ready to discuss was less productive than giving him the space and the time to arrive at disclosure on his own terms. She went about her work in the kitchen and waited, and on Wednesday morning he came in from checking the barn with a particular quality to his stillness that she recognized as information compressed into posture. "Men in the north barn," he said. She set down the cast iron pan she was holding. "How many? 4 armed. They've been there at least 2 nights." She had not heard them. She did not say this because it was not useful. "Do they know we know?" "Not yet." Ford appeared in the kitchen doorway, having heard this exchange from the main room. The pale green eyes were sharp and focused in the way they got when abstraction became concrete. Abel was behind him, sketchbook already set aside the observational distance he usually maintained, having closed into something more present and operational. The conversation that followed was the first time Wren had seen the 3 brothers work through a genuine threat together. And what it revealed was a command structure that had nothing to do with hierarchy and everything to do with function. Silas assessed. Ford pushed for immediate action, not from recklessness, but from the particular temperament of a man who finds sustained uncertainty more costly than resolved conflict. Abel listened to both of them and said at the right moment the thing that was neither Silas's caution nor Ford's urgency, but the synthesis of what was actually required. "They're waiting for us to do something," Abel said. "They don't know what we know. If we move first, we choose the ground." Silas looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded. They chose the ground. They chose it with the unhurried thoroughness of men who have lived long enough in a place that requires continuous physical vigilance to understand that preparation is not the opposite of speed, but its precondition. Wren did not wait to be assigned a role. She came to Silas directly that evening in the barn where he was making his own preparations, and she said, "Tell me what I can do." And he looked at her with the amber eyes, and she could see him working through several possible responses and discarding each one in favor of the honest one. "You know how to handle the rifle in the kitchen." "Abel showed me. I've practiced with the smaller one." "Good." He told her the rest. He told her which window gave the best angle on the approach from the north. He told her that if it went badly, the priority was the house and not the outbuildings, and the house could be defended from the kitchen in the main room if necessary. He told her to stay inside unless she had no other option, and then he paused, and she understood that the pause was him deciding whether to say the next thing. "You're not going to be a problem," he said. It was not a question. "No," she said. He nodded. He went back to his preparations. She went back to the house and moved the kitchen rifle to a position she could reach in 3 steps from any point in the room, and she stacked the morning's firewood in a configuration that left the floor clear, and she memorized the angles from the 2 windows and the door, and she did all of this with the calm efficiency of a woman who grew up without the luxury of panic and had never developed the habit. They came on a Thursday morning, just past dawn, when the light was thin and blue and the snow was deep enough to muffle the sound of their approach until they were closer than they had intended to get before announcing themselves. Wren heard them from the kitchen. She moved to her position by the window without haste, without the kind of urgency that comes from fear, with the deliberate precision of someone executing a plan. There were 4 of them. She could see 3 from her angle moving across the open ground between the north fence and the main house with the loose confident stride of men who have made this kind of approach before and expect it to conclude in their favor. The fourth she could not see, which told her something she stored immediately. The one who spoke first was tall and lean, with a quality of easy menace that sat on him like a garment he had worn so long it had shaped itself to his body. His name, she would learn later, was Greel. He called from outside the main door with the cheerful authority of a man who has done the arithmetic and concluded that it adds up in his direction. Morning, no trouble intended, just looking for supplies in a warm place while we wait out the road. She heard Silas open the main door. She did not hear him say anything. She knew what he looked like from the doorway, and she knew that what he looked like was answer enough for most questions. Now, there's no need for that kind of greeting, Greel said, still cheerful, still easy, the cheer of a man who has not yet been given reason to drop it. We've got 4 men and you've got 3. Reasonable odds for a conversation. From her position at the kitchen window, she saw the 4th man. He had circled wide around the east side of the house while the others approached the front, moving along the wall of the building toward the kitchen door with a practiced quiet that would have been effective against people who were not expecting it. She was expecting it. She positioned herself beside the kitchen door, not in front of it, to the side where she would not be visible through the small window set into the upper half. She held the rifle with both hands and kept her breathing even. She thought about what Abel had taught her about the stance and the grip and where to put her attention, and she thought about the 9-year-old boy named Ellsworth, who came twice a week to learn his letters at this kitchen table. And she thought about the jar of peaches that Abel's mother had put up in the last summer of her life, and she was not afraid. The kitchen door opened. The man who came through it was large and moved with the compressed speed of someone accustomed to entering rooms that might be defended, which was why he had his attention on the center of the kitchen and not on the wall to his left where Wren was standing. She swung the rifle stock into his temple with the controlled force of someone who has calculated the necessary amount and applied it without either hesitation or excess. He went down in the way that people go down when a significant amount of force is applied to the side of their head completely and immediately, and she stepped over him and moved to the kitchen window to understand what was happening outside. Outside, it was resolving. Ford had come from the left side of the barn in the first moment of the confrontation, and Ford, in a situation that had moved from threat to action, was something to see. Not because he was reckless, he was not, but because he was absolutely economical and absolutely committed in a way that left very little room for the situation to develop in any direction other than the one he intended. The 2 men on the left had underestimated this, which was the last significant underestimation they would make for some time. Abel had come from the right from behind the woodpile and had managed the man on that side with a quiet efficiency that was somehow more unsettling than noise would have been the efficiency of someone who has absorbed a great deal and is very selective about what he releases and when. Silas had not moved from the doorway. He had not needed to. Greel had looked at the man in front of him and then at the men on his sides and had performed the arithmetic again and found that it had changed significantly since his initial calculation, and he was standing very still with his hands open and his cheerfulness entirely evacuated. "You'll want to leave," Silas said. It was the same tone he used for everything. Flat, final, not angry, because anger implies that the outcome is uncertain, and Silas Holt was not a man who communicated uncertainty. They left. Not all of them immediately. The ones who could walk, walked. Greel walked and he walked with the particular careful movement of a man who is managing the distance between himself and a consequence he has just narrowly avoided. The man who had come through the kitchen door was conscious by the time Ford hauled him upright, and he walked also, though, with less coordination than Greel. Silas watched them until they were past the north fence and into the tree line, and the force had taken them. Then he stood for a moment longer looking at the place where they had been, and Wren, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with the rifle held correctly at her side, watched him perform this accounting. He turned. He looked at her. She had a small cut on her left hand where the door frame had caught it in the motion of swinging the stock. She had not noticed it until now. She noticed it now because blood was a specific color against the pale skin of her hand, and the winter light was very clear. Silas covered the distance between the main door and the kitchen in 3 strides. He took her hand, the injured one, without asking, and looked at the cut with the concentrated attention he gave to anything that required assessment. Small, he said. Yes. He did not release her hand. He looked at it for a moment longer than the assessment required. Then he looked up at her, and the amber eyes had in them something she had not seen there before. Something that was not Silas managing himself into an expression, but Silas simply being something without management for just a moment, in the particular way that moments of concluded danger sometimes permit. You held the kitchen, he said. Yes. Ford appeared around the corner of the house and looked at the two of them, and whatever he saw in the arrangement of the moment, he looked away again and went to check the barn, which was the right thing to do, and which he did with the tact of a man who is capable of it when the situation calls for it. Abel came and stood nearby and said nothing, which was Abel's version of the same courtesy. Silas released her hand. He went back to being Silas, which was to say he went back to the work of the day with the focused efficiency of a man for whom the work of the day is always the primary thing. But something had been added to the ledger of their interaction, something specific and irreversible, and both of them understood this, and neither of them found it necessary to discuss it. She went inside and bandaged her hand and made the morning's coffee. Later that day, Silas rode the four of them into Ridgeback because the men needed to be accounted for in the way that the frontier accounted for such things, and because Silas was a man who believed in formal processes, even when informal ones would have been sufficient. He spoke to the man who served as Ridgeback's closest approximation to a lawman, and the conversation was brief and factual, and the matter was concluded in the particular way that matters are concluded in places where the formal structures of civilization are still being assembled from available materials. On the ride back up in the mountain, Ford pulled his horse alongside the wagon and said without preamble, "You hit him with the stock." "Yes," she said, "not the barrel. The stock is more reliable for close quarters." Ford was quiet for a moment. Then he said to the mountain ahead of them, and not precisely to her, "All right." Coming from Ford, this was the equivalent of a standing ovation. That evening, after the fire was built and the horses were tended, in the specific and precise exhaustion of a day that had contained genuine danger had settled over the house, the four of them sat at the table together. This was not unusual. What was unusual was the quality of the sitting, which had in it something that had not been present before, a density that was not tension, but its resolution. The feeling of air after lightning has done what it came to do. Abel opened his sketchbook. He drew while the others sat, and no one spoke for a long time. And the fire gave its amber light to the room, and the mountain held its cold silence outside. And the space between the four people at the table was for the first time the space between people who have been through something together and have come out of it on the same side. Then Ford said something that no one had expected him to say. He said it quietly, without prologue, in the tone he used when he had been thinking about something long enough that the words had finally worn through whatever was holding them back. "There was a woman," he said, "before you, not from the agency, someone from Ridgeback." He looked at the table. "Her name was Catherine. She was here for 3 weeks. She left because—" He stopped, started again. "She said I couldn't say what I felt. She said a man who couldn't say what he felt deserved to be alone." The room was very still. "She wasn't wrong about the problem," he said. "She was wrong about the cure." Wren looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at his hands. "Ford," she said. He looked up. "You just said what you felt," she said, "in front of 3 people." He sat with all this for a moment. Something moved across his face, not the wry deflection he usually deployed when something got too close to his actual interior, but something more unguarded than that. "Huh," he said. Abel made a sound that was almost a laugh. Silas looked at the fire. Wren looked at her coffee cup and did not smile, because smiling would have broken something that needed to hold its shape for a moment longer. It was after this, after Abel had gone to bed, that Ford stopped Silas at the door to the main hall. Wren was in the kitchen and could hear them, not every word, but enough the way you hear things in a house that has gone quiet and let sound travel farther than it should. Ford's voice, low and direct. She's not here by accident, Silas. A pause. Silas's voice even lower, I know that. Then say so before she decides for herself that we're not worth deciding for. Another pause longer this time, the kind of pause that belongs to a man turning something over in his mind that he has been carrying face down for a long time. Abel's voice from somewhere near the hallway, dry and precise in the way that Abel's observations always were when he had been listening long enough to be certain. She already decided. She decided on the third day. The rest of us have just been catching up. Neither Silas nor Ford responded to this. The hall went quiet. Wren set down the dish she was holding and looked at the wall for a long moment, at the grain of the wood and the lamplight moving across it in the stillness of a house that was in its own unhurried way becoming something it had not been before she arrived. Then she dried her hands and went to find Silas in the barn. He was there checking on Copper, whose leg had continued its recovery through December with the steady, unhurried dedication of an animal that has no opinion about being unwell and simply gets on with the business of improving. Silas was moving his hands down the mare's leg in the careful, systematic way of a man who has done this 1,000 times and finds in the repetition a kind of ordered thought. She came into the barn and stood at the stall rail, and he did not stop what he was doing. Silas, she said. He did not stop. I need to tell you something. He stopped. He straightened up and turned to look at her, and in the lantern light of the barn, his face was open in the way it had been open on the night of the storm, the particular openness of a man who has lowered something he has been carrying at chin height for so long that the lowering of it feels like exposure. The letter, she said. He waited. The ones you sent to the agency, over 2 years. I read them before I agreed to come. She watched his face. Not the agency's correspondence. Your letters. They were misfiled, and I found them, and I read them. A pause. All of them. He was very still. You wrote about the sunrise over the eastern ridge, she said. You wrote about the way spring arrives in the valley, and about the root cellar, and about what this place asks of a person who intends to stay. You wrote about all of it in the same letter, the practical things and the things that were not practical, and you did not treat them as different categories. He looked at her for a long moment. A man who writes about sunrise and root cellars in the same letter, she said, is a man who believes that all of it matters equally, that there is no division between what is beautiful and what is necessary because where he lives, they are the same thing. She paused. I came because of the letters. I came because of what they told me about the person who wrote them. The lantern swayed slightly in the draft from the barn door. Copper shifted her weight. You came for the letters, Silas said. His voice was low and careful, the voice of a man moving through territory he has mapped but not yet walked. I came for the man who wrote them, she said. And then I arrived and discovered he had 2 brothers, which made the situation considerably more complicated. But I came for you. The thing that happened to Silas Holt's face in the moment after she said this was not something she would ever be able to describe with precision. It was not the dramatic transformation of a man whose walls come down all at once. It was something subtler and more permanent than that, the shift that happens when a thing that has been held in suspension for a very long time finally finds a surface it was waiting for. He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps. He took her face in his hands, the large, rough, careful hands that had built the walls of this house, and pulled a rifle through a blizzard and held a coffee cup across a table in the middle of a storm. And he looked at her for one moment with the full and mediated attention of a man who has spent 4 years being very careful about what he allows himself to want. I don't know how to do this, he said. I don't know how to say the things that people say. You wrote 3 pages about a sunrise, she said. You know how. He kissed her then in the lantern light of the barn with the horse warm and present beside them, and the cold pressing against the walls, and the mountain holding everything in its enormous, indifferent patience. It was not a tentative kiss. It was not the kiss of a man who is uncertain about what he wants. It was the kiss of a man who has been certain for some time and has been waiting for the moment when certainty became permission. When he raised his head, she kept her eyes closed for one moment. Then she opened them. "The spring road opens in April," she said. "Yes. Then we go to see Amos Marsh in April." He looked at her with the amber eyes that had, over the course of one winter, learned a new thing, which was how to hold warmth without fear of what warmth costs. "You are where you belong," he said. It came out quiet and without ornamentation, the way true things come out when a person has stopped managing the distance between what they know and what they say. She put her hand on his arm, the scarred, work-hardened, warm arm of a man who had been alone on a mountain for 4 years with two brothers in a grief he had finally said the name of. "I know," she said. "I've known since the third day." They walked back to the house together through the cold December night, and the mountain held its silence around them, and the stars over the eastern ridge were the same stars that Silas had looked at for years, from the same piece of ground. And they were the same stars that Wren had never seen this clearly, because she had spent her life in cities where the light obscured them. She could see them now. She intended to keep seeing them. April came to Montana the way Silas had written about it, slowly, with the particular integrity of a season that does not arrive until it is genuinely ready. The snow retreated from the south-facing slopes first, then from the valley floor, then from the road to Ridgeback, which opened on the 15th of the month, in a condition that Drummond declared passable with appropriate caution. Drummond drove them down to Ridgeback himself, all four of them in the wagon, which had not carried all four of them anywhere since the supply run in November, that felt in retrospect like something from a different era entirely. The mountain had a different quality in April, the same essential immensity, but altered in tone, as though the cold had been an argument it was making, and it had decided for the time being to concede the point. Amos Marsh was a compact, gray-bearded man of 60 who had been performing the various ceremonies of the frontier for 30 years and had developed over that time a quality of unhurried dignity that made even the simplest of occasions feel properly attended to. His office was small and smelled of wood oil and old paper, and the particular combination of those things that belongs to spaces where records are kept. He had the formal document from November on his desk. He produced a new document, which Wren read with the complete attention she gave to all written things, and which she found accurate in its terms and reasonable in its construction. She signed it. Silas signed it. Ford and Abel witnessed standing side by side in the small office with the particular stillness of men participating in something they know is significant and have agreed to honor with their full presence. Marsh read the words of the ceremony in a voice that was neither hurried nor ceremonial, just human and clear, and Silas repeated them with the steady certainty of a man making a statement he has already made to himself many times over and is now making to the world. When it was Wren's turn, she said the words as written, and then she added, not from any script, 4 words that were simply true and that she had been carrying since November and needed now to say in the right place. "And I will stay." Marsh paused, looked at her over his reading glasses with the attentive warmth of a man who has heard a great many things said in this room and knows when something genuine is being said. Silas looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved barely in the way it moved when something that he had not permitted himself to expect arrived anyway, and found him without adequate defense against it. Ford, standing beside Abel, looked at the ceiling briefly with an expression that was not his ordinary expression at all. Abel looked at his boots and then looked up and across at Wren with the gray eyes that saw everything clearly and always had, and in those eyes she saw what she had come to understand over the course of a winter as their highest expression, which was recognition. He saw her. He had always seen her, and what he saw was someone who was staying. Drummond drove them back up the mountain in the April afternoon with the windows of the wagon letting in a light that was entirely different from the light of November, warmer and less decided, full of the particular possibility that the thaw carries in its first weeks. He said very little on the way up, being a man whose observations tended toward the practical, but at the gate of Holt's Ridge, when he pulled the horses to a stop and they all climbed down, he looked at Wren with his weathered, unhurried face and said, Well, she agreed. He drove away down the mountain road. She did not watch him go. She looked at the house that Silas's father had started, And Silas had finished, and Ford and Abel had maintained through the years of difficulty the stone and timber of it, the thick walls and the wide chimney, in the east window that faced the ridge where the sunrise came each morning without fail, and she felt in her chest the particular weight of a thing that is not heavy because it burdens you, but because it is substantial, because it is real, and it is yours, and it will not be taken away. They went inside. The fire needed building. She built it without ceremony, without thought, the way she built everything at Holt's Ridge now, as someone who belonged to the task and to the place that required it. That was the first day of the rest of it. Yeah. The first spring together established the rhythm that would govern Holt's Ridge for decades. Not because anyone designed it or decided on it, but because the rhythm that emerges from people working and living together in a place that requires real effort tends to find its own form, and the form it found at Holt's Ridge was one that used everyone well. Wren planted the kitchen garden along the south wall of the house in April, choosing her crops with the careful attention she had given to the supply calculations in winter, thinking forward through the seasons, in the way she had learned to think about things, not just what was needed now, but what would be needed then. Abel built the fence around the garden with a precision that suggested he had been planning its dimensions for some time. Ford, watching the progress of the fence, said nothing for 3 days, and then appeared one morning and added a gate that opened more easily than the one Abel had designed, which was more elegant but less practical, and no one discussed this because it did not require discussion. Silas watched all of it from various distances, the way he watched everything, and what showed in his face across those spring weeks was something she had not seen there in the full entirety of the winter. It was not happiness exactly, not the simple upward variety of happiness. It was something older and more durable than that, the expression of a man who has been in a place that he loves and has been managing his love for it in the diminished way that you manage love when you are alone, and who is now loving it in its full measure because there is someone to love it alongside him. She understood. She felt it too. Ellsworth Breckenridge continued his twice-weekly visits through the spring and into the summer, and by June he could read 3 pages of the primer without assistance and had developed under Wren's patient and specific instruction a careful, clear hand for writing his letters. His father came by once to acknowledge this, a man of few words in the tradition of the region, and what he said to Silas was simply that the boy had changed and he was grateful, and Silas said that the credit was not his to take, and they left it there. In late June, a letter arrived from Oregon. It came with the general mail that Drummond carried up from Ridgeback once a week, tucked among the supply invoices and the agricultural notices in the occasional newspaper, and it was addressed in a hand that none of them immediately recognized. Silas read it alone, as he had done with the box and with the letters that had preceded everything, and he was in the room with it for 2 hours before he came out. He sat down at the table where Wren was working on the supply ledger, and he placed the letter on the table between them, and he said, "Cormac." She looked at him. She had heard the name once from Ford on the 3rd night of the blizzard, in the low, urgent conversation that Ford had pressed into the darkness of a storm-sealed night, the kind of unburdening that men sometimes manage when the weather removes every other option. She had heard the name, and she had carried it since then with the same patience she had carried everything else that required patience. "He is alive," Silas said. "Portland. He has a wife, a daughter not yet 2 years old." She waited. "He wants to come in the fall," Silas said. "He says he has been trying to find the right words for 3 years and has finally accepted that there are no right words and the visit is the thing." "He is correct," Wren said. Silas looked at her. "The West Room," she said. "It will hold a family of 3 comfortably." He sat with this for a moment, the way he sat with all things that mattered, giving them the full weight of his attention. Then he said, "You knew about him." "Ford told me during the blizzard," she said. "I didn't think it was my information to erase." "It wouldn't have changed anything," he said, "if you had known from the beginning." "I know that," she said, "but you needed to be the one to say it when you were ready to say it." He looked at her with the amber eyes that had become over the course of a season the most familiar thing in the landscape of her daily life, as familiar and as essential as the ridge and the well, and the particular smell of the kitchen in the morning. How did you know that? He said. Because I read your letter, she said. And I knew what kind of man you were before I knew anything else about you. In September, Cormac Holt came. He was 40 years old and he looked like what the Holt brothers would look like in 10 years. The same essential structure of face and frame, but softened by a decade of different decisions, a different life carved out in a different landscape. He came with his wife, a quiet woman named Iris, who had the particular quality of someone who loves a complicated person and has made her peace with the complications. He came with the daughter, a small and imperious creature named June, who was not yet 2, and had absolutely no opinion about any of the historical difficulty that surrounded her father's arrival, and was interested primarily in the kitchen cat that had arrived at Holt's Ridge in May from no discernible origin and had installed itself with the confidence of something that knew a good situation when it found one. The reunion between the 4 brothers was a private thing. Wren took Iris and June to the garden and showed them the late vegetables and let the men have the time they needed, and she did not ask Silas afterward what was said. She did not need to. She could see in the way he held his shoulders for the 2 weeks of Cormac's visit that something had been set down finally after 3 years of carrying it. When Cormac left, he shook Wren's hand at the wagon and held it for a moment and said, "He wrote to me about you in February. He said he had found someone who understood what the place asked of a person." A pause. I think he meant more than the place. She said, "Give June our love." He drove away down the mountain road and did not look back, which was the right way to leave a place you have made your peace with. Time moved the way it moves in places where the work is real and the seasons are definitive, and each year makes a mark on the land and the people who tend it. The child came at the end of 1874 in December, earlier than expected, but healthy and certain of himself from the first breath arriving in the East Room where Wren had arrived 13 months earlier, with 1 trunk and 1 carpet bag, and no certainty about anything except that she had made her decision and intended to keep it. The child was a boy, and he was healthy, and he had, as Ford announced from the doorway where he stood, with an expression that was doing several things at once, ears that were entirely his father's. Silas held the child with his large, careful hands, and for the first time in the years that Wren had known him, she saw his hands shake. Not from weakness, from the particular weight of holding something that has arrived after you had stopped believing in its possibility. They named him Rutledge for the grandfather who had laid the stone foundations of the house and taught 3 sons what it meant to build something intended to last. Abel drew the child that night in the lamplight, Rutledge in Silas's arms, the father's face bent toward the son's face in the attitude of a man who has found in one small creature a reason to lower every guard he has ever built. The drawing was careful and true, and Abel kept it, which meant he understood it was the kind of thing that should be kept. Ford married Hazel Briggs in the spring of 1878. Hazel was a widow from Ridgeback, 29 years old, with a directness that matched Ford's directness so precisely that their first 3 interactions had consisted almost entirely of each of them being surprised that the other one said exactly what they meant and did not apologize for it. Ford had tried his usual gambit of mild intimidation on the 3rd meeting, and Hazel had looked at him with the particular equanimity of a woman who has already survived something genuinely difficult and does not intend to be diminished by something that is mostly theater, and she had said, "You can keep doing that if you find it satisfying. I'll still be here." Ford had come home that evening and said to Wren, without additional context, "I think I'm going to marry the Briggs woman." "I think you should," Wren said. He had thought about this for 3 more weeks before doing it, which was for Ford a relatively swift decision. Abel did not marry. This was not a cause of concern or discussion at Holt's Ridge because Abel's life had taken a shape that suited him, and that made sense to anyone who paid attention. He had become gradually and without announcement the person that the surrounding community brought its problems to, not for solutions exactly, but for the particular quality of listening that Bell offered, the listening of someone who had spent years observing before speaking, and therefore when he spoke said something worth hearing. Children came to learn to draw. Adults came to sit in the quiet of his workshop and talk about things they could not talk about elsewhere. He had never stopped drawing. The walls of his workshop were covered with sketches of everyone who had ever lived at or visited Holt's Ridge, and the record they made together was something between a history and a testimony. The years made their marks. Rutledge grew into a boy who had his father's steadiness and his mother's capacity for attention, which was a combination that served him well in the high country. He learned ranch work the way all Holt men learned it, by doing it alongside the men who did it, starting with the smallest tasks and expanding outward as his competence warranted. By the time he was 12, he could split wood and track an animal through fresh snow and read a weather change in the quality of the afternoon light over the eastern ridge. And by the time he was 16, he was doing the work of a man, and doing it, Silas noted, without particular ceremony, correctly. Hazel and Ford had two daughters born in 1880 and 1882, who were their parents' children in every visible way, which is to say they were direct and capable and not easily impressed by things that were mostly theater, and they treated the ranch and the mountain and the wide sky over the valley as their natural inheritance, which it was. Wren taught all of the children. This was not a formal arrangement. It was simply what happened when a former teacher lived in the middle of a group of children who needed teaching, and it expanded over the years to include the Breckenridge children and several others from the surrounding ranches, and the school that eventually opened in Ridgeback in 1881 employed a teacher who had learned her methods in part from spending 3 winters watching Wren work through a primer with Ellsworth Breckenridge at a kitchen table. Wren kept the ledgers. She had begun with the supply ledger and expanded into the ranch accounts as it became clear that her capacity for this kind of systematic attention was considerably greater than any of the brothers, and that Silas, who trusted her with everything else, trusted her with this too. The accounts of Holt's Ridge were for the 20 years she kept them completely accurate and clearly annotated, which was a thing that could not have been said of them in the years before she arrived. She kept the kitchen garden. It expanded south along the wall each spring until it was large enough to require Ford to build a second fence section, which he built without discussion, adding the same kind of gate he had added to Abel's original design, the one that opened easily because Ford's design philosophy, if he had ever articulated, it would have been that the practical and the elegant are not opposites and that good work is both. She kept the ring. Not in the drawer. She had moved it in the first spring to the small shelf above the kitchen window where the morning light came through, and she had placed it there not as an act of replacement or revision, but as an act of continuation. Constance had been here. She had been real, and she had been loved, and she had understood the place and what it asked, and she had left behind a ring and a portrait on a canvas, and a man who had learned to love again more slowly and more carefully and more completely than he had known how to before the grief. The portrait was no longer in the storage hall. It hung in the main room in a frame that Abel had made properly on the wall beside the door to the east hall. This had been Wren's suggestion and Silas's decision, and the decision had taken him the better part of a year to make, and when he made it, he carried the portrait from the storage hall and hung it himself and stood in front of it for a long time. "She would have liked you," he said eventually. "I think I would have liked her," Wren said. They stood together in front of the portrait for a while, the three of them, in the way that the living and the dead sometimes stand together in a house that has held them all, and then Silas put his arm around Wren's shoulders, and they went back to the work of the day. 20 years. In 1894, on a morning in late September that had the particular quality of early autumn in the high country, a quality that is different from autumn anywhere else, the light harder and cleaner, and the cold already present at the edges of the day, like something leaning in from just outside the frame. Wren stood at the kitchen step and looked out over the ranch. The barn that Silas and Cormac's father had built was still standing, reinforced twice over the years, but essentially the same structure, the same proportions, the same relationship to the landscape around it. The north fence that Ford had rebuilt in the summer of 1876 ran straight and solid along the tree line. The kitchen garden was done for the season. The beds turned the last of the squash brought in and stored in the root cellar that had been there since before any of them could remember. Rutledge was at the far fence working. He was 19 years old, and the ranch would be his. In the way that things pass from one generation to the next, in places where continuity is the point not through formal transfer, but through the accumulated authority of competence and presence and love for the land. Silas was with him. Silas was slower now, not much, but enough that she noticed it enough that Rutledge had positioned himself without discussion so that the heavier work fell to him and the directing work fell to his father. And this transition had happened so naturally that it was already simply the way things were. Ford's daughters were in the yard with a project that involved considerably more noise than it required, which was in keeping with their characters. Hazel was in the dairy barn. Abel was on the porch with his sketchbook, which was where Abel tended to be when the light was this quality. He looked up when she came to stand nearby. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning." He looked back at his drawing, then he turned the sketchbook so she could see it. It was the ranch. Holt's Ridge is seen from the eastern slope above the house, the same view he had drawn for her on the 3rd day of November in 1873, the same composition that had been his first gift to her, the map of a place that was becoming her home. The same view 20 years later, and the differences between the two drawings told the whole story if you knew how to read it. More structures, more fences, a kitchen garden along the south wall, a second barn, children's figures in the yard, small and specific and unmistakably themselves. She looked at it for a long time. "You've been drawing this place for 20 years, she said. "Someone should keep the record," he said. She understood that he was not talking only about the ranch. She looked out at the yard at Ford's daughters and the sound they were making and the life they were making it in at Hazel coming out of the dairy barn with a pail and the particular purposeful efficiency that was her permanent quality at the fence line, where Rutledge and Silas were working, and at the mountains beyond all of it, the same mountains that had stood in this landscape before any of them, and would stand here after holding the valley and the ranch and the lives within it with the absolute and indifferent patience of things that do not distinguish between what is temporary and what endures. Silas looked up from the fence line. Across the distance of the yard and the garden and the years, he looked at her. He raised one hand, not a wave exactly, an acknowledgement, the gesture of a man who sees his wife standing at the kitchen step in the September light and wants her to know that he sees her. She raised her hand in return. 20 years ago, she had stood on the step of a stagecoach on a gray November afternoon and looked at 3 men who did not come forward to greet her, and she had felt the full weight of what she had agreed to, the irreversibility of the choice, the distance from everything familiar, the absolute uncertainty of how it would unfold. She had known even then that she was not going to leave. She had not been able to say why not, precisely not in the way that reasons are supposed to work, with clear logic and provable premises. She had only known that the man who wrote about sunrise and root cellars in the same letter was a man whose attention was organized around what was real and that she had been looking for that her entire adult life and had not found it until a clerk in a Philadelphia agency office handed her a misfiled bundle of papers, and she sat down to wait for her appointment and began to read. This was where the reading had led, this yard, this mountain, this man looking across the distance and seeing her. Drummond drove up the mountain road once a week, still slower now, the horses older but reliable. He had taken to stopping at Holt's Ridge not for necessity, but from the habit of 20 years, which had transformed what began as professional obligation into something in the vicinity of friendship. Frontier variety of friendship that does not require much conversation, but does require showing up. He had told his wife in the first year that the 7th woman was different. His wife had asked how he knew. He had said that she stepped off the coach like someone who had already decided. His wife had said that all women decide things. He had said yes, but this one decided and then did not undecide, which is the harder part. He had been right about all of it. She had stepped off that coach like someone who had already decided, and she had never once looked back down the mountain. She went back into the kitchen. The fire needed tending, and the morning had the cold in it that said the season was serious and intended to be taken seriously. She put the logs on with the ease of someone who has done this thousands of times and found in the repetition not tedium, but the deep satisfaction of a task performed well in service of something that matters. The east window caught the morning light and held it briefly in the room warm and specific, the light of a Montana autumn that is also the light of 20 years of mornings that have accumulated into a life. She had watched this light come through this window since November of 1873, and she intended to watch it for a great many more mornings because the mountain was patient and the house was solid, and the man who had built it kept his word. She had said in the church in Ridgeback on an April day in 1874 that she would stay. She was staying. That had always been the whole of it.